Let me introduce you our first speaker, Kathryn Sikkink, Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, is an international relations scholar best known for her work on human rights, international norms, transnational advocacy networks, social movements, and transitional justice. Her books include Activists Beyond Borders, Advocacy Networks in International Politics, The Justice Cascade, How Human Rights Prosecutions Are Changing World Politics, Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century, and her most recent book, which just came out earlier this year, I think in January, from Yale University Press, The Hidden Face of Rights, Toward a Politics of Responsibility. Professor Sikkink has been a Fulbright Scholar in Argentina and a Guggenheim Fellow. She holds a PhD from Columbia University, and she's joining us from Uruguay.
Well, first, thank you, Yeva, for that introduction, and thank you for serving as our moderator. And I also want to thank the organizers and sponsors of the event at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. And it is a pleasure and an honor for me to share this panel with Sergio and with Flavia, who are great colleagues and friends, amazing public intellectuals, and human rights advocates. So I'll keep to 10 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time to get directly to their presentations. Now, as I think we are all aware, human rights issues are central to the coronavirus crisis. Not only our individual and collective rights to health, but also our rights to liberty, freedom of movement, to education, information, food, and shelter are all at stake. And importantly, we're also finding that people's rights to be free from discrimination are also in play, because it's already clear that COVID-19 places undue burdens on the poorest and most vulnerable parts of the population. Now, today I'll be talking about my new book because many of the ideas in the book are pertinent to this coronavirus situation. The book is called The Hidden Face of Rights Toward a Politics of Responsibility. It's published by Yale University Press just in January this year. And in it, I argue that to fully implement human rights, we need to place more emphasis on the responsibility of all actors and not just states, to take action together to make sure rights are enjoyed. Now, because we have an audience here that's interested in Latin American issues, I wanted to begin by sharing with you how I got interested in thinking about rights and responsibilities. I was doing research for my last book, Evidence for Hope, on Latin American contributions to international human rights law. This is a topic that Flavia knows very well. And I argued that the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man, La Declaración Americana de Derechos y Deberes del Hombre, was one of the important founding documents of the international human rights regime. And it should have been called the Inter-American Declaration or the Latin American Declaration because it was produced by the delegates of 20 Latin American states and the United States in Bogota in April 1948, 8 full months before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, note that this is a declaration of rights and duties. And so I got interested in the duties part. Where did that come from? And these were rights and duties of individuals. So Latin American states in 1948, at the birth of the human rights regime, were already insisting on the simultaneous importance of rights and duties. These included the duty to vote, to educate oneself and one's children, to do military service, etc. And so as I dug a little more, I discovered there was actually the delegate from Mexico who was responsible for writing the first draft of the duties section. And in it, he drew ideas from the Mexican Constitution of 1917, which is famous for, again, being an extremely early document that has important human rights language, but also duties language. So talking about rights and responsibilities is nothing new in Latin America, but it was partly lost in the move to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where these duties were distilled into a single article. Even so, Latin American delegates who participated in drafting the Universal Declaration made sure the Declaration recognizes that each of us has duties to the community. So in the book, I discuss these duties to the community. but I talk about them as forward-looking responsibilities, where all actors who are socially connected to a human rights issue and able to act need to work together to address the injustice. And so you can see how relevant this is to the current coronavirus crisis. And when I say we need to think about responsibility of all actors, I mean states, of course, and also international organizations, state and municipal governments, corporations, NGOs, universities, individuals, etc. You know, for example, even if all governments were taking efficient action, and we know they're not, but even if they were, if individuals didn't also do their share by staying home, washing their hands, no country could begin to bend the curve. So as we know, many, many individuals have stepped up to take responsibility, but others have not. And as we've seen in the protests in many states in the United States, we have protesters who claim that their rights to assemble are being infringed, and they have to liberate their states from social isolation policies. These same groups are now starting to stress their right not to be vaccinated when a vaccine is developed. So these US libertarians, I wouldn't call them human rights activists, but libertarians are a good illustration of what happens when people think only about their rights and don't think about their responsibility to protect the rights of others. So in this crisis, governments need to strike a balance between protecting our collective right to health and respecting other human rights like a right to movement. A quarantine is a legitimate, necessary state policy in times of health emergencies, but states must attend to the rights of individuals caught in the quarantine, their rights to adequate health care, food, shelter, the right not to be discriminated against, etc. So I think Sergio and Flavia may address some of these issues in their presentations. Now, in ordinary times, people sometimes like to talk mainly about their rights and less about their responsibilities to the community and duties to promote the rights of others. But this is an extraordinary situation that we live in today, and it reminds us that the rights of all are linked intrinsically to the responsibilities of the broader community. So in this case, sometimes we have simple responsibilities, you know, to stay at home, to avoid travel, wash our hands, cover mouths, but also to be informed, not to panic, not to hoard essential items. We have a responsibility to support those health workers or sanitation workers or the workers delivering food from restaurants who don't have the luxury of staying at home. But we also have a responsibility to think about what comes next. And so I want to just briefly illustrate my forward-looking model of responsibility by relating it to the issue of the vaccine for coronavirus, something I've been thinking and writing about lately. Once a vaccine is developed, many actors will have responsibilities to get it to people in a rapid and affordable way. And in particular, I believe that if these vaccines are patented, they will not be able to do the job they must do. You know, there's lots of talk about vaccines, but have you noticed we're not hearing much about patents? There was one op-ed in the Boston Globe last week by a doctor from Doctors Without Borders calling for an end to patents. But we know right now that scientists from all over the world are working together to share their discoveries so that vaccine research can move ahead quickly. And just yesterday, we learned that the world leaders have joined together to pledge $8 billion for vaccine research. But what we don't know about is who's going to hold the patent. Will there be a patent? Now, the strategy that Donald Trump is pursuing in the United States is one that suggests that these drugs are not going to be made available to the whole world. So Trump is first announced he was freezing funding to WHO, one of the institutions helping actors work together. He refused to collaborate with world leaders in funding research and prefers to go at it alone. He's now working with US-based pharmaceutical companies to produce a vaccine quickly. But if these companies find the vaccine first, they are almost certainly going to insist on patenting it, which will make it expensive and hard to deliver globally. The high cost of a patented monopoly medicine is the last thing we need at this stage in the struggle against the pandemic. So Trump's plans appear to be involving keeping the vaccine for the US first, and thus away from other parts of the world where it will be desperately needed. But herd immunity only works if the vast majority of the population is immune. The herd immunity we need is is of the human herd, not the US herd. Our fates are inextricably linked to the fate of others around the world. The wall doesn't stop transmission of a pandemic. All people must work together to secure rapid and affordable access for everyone to the vaccine. And this is not going to happen if a handful of corporations patent the vaccine. So how do we make that happen? Well, looking at past examples, I promise you that change in government and pharmaceutical industry policy will only come as a result of public pressure. We need to set one new human rights agenda, in the words of a new social movement, to free the vaccine for COVID-19. WHO, along with some public-private partnerships like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, called CEPI, is seeking to ensure affordable vaccine access. But human rights activists need to step up to this vaccine issue to kind of provide support for these initiatives. And there's some precedent for producing vaccines without patent. The polio vaccines in the 1950s were released without patents because, in the words of Jonas Salk, who was one of the inventors of one of the vaccines, these belong to the people, in part because individuals had contributed funds through an NGO, the March of Dimes, for polio research. But there's also some precedent for how social movements can work on this patent issue. So during the HIV/AIDS crisis in South Africa, there was a local social movement, the Treatment Action Campaign, or TAC, that was linked to a transnational advocacy network. And they were able to raise global awareness about the exorbitant costs of patented antiretroviral drugs and protect South Africa's right to import generics in times of crisis. So something like these campaigns are going to we need to start talking about it now. We can't wait until the vaccine is released to free the vaccine. And so I want to give that example because I think this new crisis shows why we need to stress both rights and responsibilities. And we're literally, in this case, we can only protect our rights by exercising responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Just a reminder to the audience that you can post your questions during the presentations, and we will address them after we hear from all the panelists. So our next speaker is Flávia Piovesan, who is a member of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. She's a professor of constitutional law and human rights at the Catholic University of São Paulo, where she's been since 1991. She's also a PhD professor at the University of Buenos Aires and a professor at the Academy on Human Rights and Humanitarian Law of the American University in the United States. She conducted postdoctoral research in Harvard Law School, Oxford University, and Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, where she studied regional human rights protection systems. In 2018, she was Lehman Visiting Scholar at David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. She has been a professor of human rights in the postgraduate programs of the Catholic University of Paraná and the Pablo de Olavide University in Seville, Spain. She was Special Secretary of Human Rights in Brazil and chaired the National Commission for the Eradication of Slave Labor. She's the author of numerous academic publications and has worked as a consultant for international organizations. Flávia? Please unmute yourself.
Unmute, sorry. So good afternoon. First, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to Dr. Klaes. I miss my sabbatical time, Dr. Klaes, for the special invitation to join in such a fascinating panel with Kathryn, with Sergio, and moderated by Eva. I feel very honored to be back to have you together, Kathryn, to talk to you, to listen and to learn from you and Sergio. And my talk will focus on our work at the Commission. So my focus is how to understand human rights and responsibilities in times of coronas from the perspective of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. which I have the honor to serve as a member. So I'd like to address three central questions. First, how to understand the impact of the pandemic in the Americas from a human rights approach. Secondly, what role has the Commission played in promoting and protecting rights in such hard times? And finally, what lessons have been learned so far? What are the human rights perspectives, or what are the prospects for human rights in the future? So I'd like to focus on the first question, how to understand the impact of the pandemic in the Americas from a human rights approach. So this question leads to our peculiar and specific regional context, I'd say characterized by three structural challenges. First, deep inequality. Second, a strong pattern of discrimination and unrule of law. And I would say that the pandemic has even aggravated and greatly exacerbated those challenges. So the first, deep social and economic inequality. Latin America displays the highest inequality level in the world. 6 of the 20 most unequal countries in the world are here in the region of Latin America. Today, 30% of the population in Latin America lives in poverty and 11% in extreme poverty. So the pandemic reveals that there are the ones who die because they are too poor to stay alive, such as the 25% of the population who lacks access to drinking water and basic sanitation, and 53% of the population who works in the informal sector. The second challenge has to do with the pattern of discrimination. So the African descendant population accounts for approximately 25% of Latin American population. With regard to indigenous peoples, it's estimated that it accounts for 10% of Latin American population. And all social indicators demonstrate a systematic, a historical pattern of discrimination, exclusion, violence affecting them, and even women and children subjected to overlapping discrimination. I'd like to quote Bachelet when she says that the virus is not discriminatory, but its impact is. So, for example, in Brazil, African descendants have higher lethality regarding the virus. 81,000 indigenous face a critical vulnerability situation. In the US, African descendants and Hispanics are twice as likely to die of the disease as the white. And the third structural challenge has to do with the rule of law. So the 2018 Latino Barometer survey on support of democracy in Latin America found that only 48% of the interviews, less than a half, consider democracy to be preferable to any other form of government. According to Pew Research Center, non-democratic alternatives would have a rate of endorsement of 23% in Brazil, 27% in Mexico, and 18% in Argentina. Over half of the countries in the region are placed in the bottom half of the most government's indicators, including the rule of law index. According to Transparency International, there is an increase of corruption as COVID-19 is a perfect storm for the corrupt, facing the collapse of the health system and mitigating monitoring mechanisms of transparency. So I'd say that the pandemic presents the hugest test for our democracies and rule of law in the region, as it empowers executive branch and the army, which take even a major role in the region. So I would, facing those challenges, I would move to my second question. So what role has the Inter-American Commission played in promoting and protecting human rights in such hard times? The Commission has the mandate to protect and to promote human rights in the region, involving and embracing 35 countries and being guided by the Inter-American standards. The victim-centric approach inspires our work, the need to safeguard human dignity and to prevent human suffering. So what have been our response to those three structural challenges? I'd say that our response adopted the language of human rights on one hand, and on the other hand, the language of the state legal duties, state legal obligations, according to our mandate. So we adopt last April as resolution number 1, 2020 on pandemic and human rights in the Americas, bringing 85 recommendations to the states. We also created a special unit to monitor the state's response in the region from the human rights approach to COVID-19. So addressing deep inequality, the Commission strengthened the language of rights, the language of social, economic, cultural, environmental rights, endorsing the state legal obligations in protecting such rights as right to health, right to drinking water, right to adequate food, to work, to shelter. So here I share totally the view of Kathryn. And here we have to face this tension between private liberties, such as freedom of movement and public health. But in Corona times, priority should be given to collective public health, to stop and to slow the spread of the virus, as there is no treatment, there is no vaccine until now. So we stress here, we emphasize the state legal duty to save lives, to prevent deaths, adopting all the measures and due diligence. So giving total priority to the right to health and its basic social components, and even adopting public policies and action plans based on the best scientific evidence in a transparent, participatory, clear way, and ensuring effective social protection, including subsidized basic rental, universal basic income, economic support to the most vulnerable, to the most in need, to the most fragile. Concerning the historical discrimination pattern, that is the second challenge, we strengthen the language of equality and non-discrimination, giving special attention to the protection of the most vulnerable and endorsing the international legal responsibilities of the states to provide reinforced protection to those groups, such as the elderly, such as women. We are facing in the region a significant increase of gender violence. The number of feminicide almost double in the whole region. So here we have recommendations demanding states to adopt gender perspective policies, addressing the increase of violence against women, and even creating alternative channels, mechanisms for protection, special protocols. This is essential towards indigenous peoples. As I said, 10% of our population. We stress the need of states to provide information about the pandemic in their traditional language, to respect unconditionally no contact with indigenous peoples who are in voluntary isolation, given the very severe impact that the virus could have, even threatening their survival as peoples. And we have also recommendations addressed to the states in the field of LGBTI rights, children and adolescent, African descendant, persons with disabilities, and also persons deprived of liberty. And finally, the unrule of law. So this is another challenge. And here the Commission is strengthening the language of civil and political rights, fundamental freedoms, and rule of law. We emphasize that any and all restriction and limitations on human rights to protect health in the context of COVID shall comply with the standards of international human rights law. In particular, the principles of legality, strict proportionality in protecting health. In addition, all suspensions and restrictions of rights shall be temporary, shall not be tolerated under post-COVID under so-called normal conditions. So here we stress rights as the importance to protect access of information, freedom of expression, media. So here we have very clear recommendations that the states should not bring civil or criminal actions against human rights defenders, against journalists because of their opinions, not detaining them on the basis of a broad and ambiguous criminal charge. And we addressed already critical situations in Cuba, in Venezuela. This morning in Bolivia, cases very, I'd say, serious case of cyber patrols. The access of information to ensure the right to access of public information in the framework of the emergency, not setting general limits based on reasons of security or public order. And I'd like to end up with my final question. What lessons have been learned so far? What are the prospects of the human rights in the future? I'd say that the COVID innovates the human rights agenda, fomenting three emergent contemporary priorities. So I'd say that today, more than ever, our humanity, our human rights depends on three priorities. And here, once again, I share Kathryn's view about, first, global science from a human rights approach. It's essential to ensure the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and to share the scientific benefits, ensuring that COVID vaccine or treatment are available and affordable to all. So here I endorse the cosmopolitan virtue of science, which has granted us the gifts of life and health. Second, solidarity, the need to strengthen the human rights culture based on the value of human dignity and especially human rights solidarity. So as each individual, as Kathryn so clearly and brightly showed, and the state have duties to save lives and prevent deaths. And finally, international cooperation. Global challenges demand global response. We need to foster international cooperation and a better articulation and coordination of public policies looking at the global governance. So at the Commission, we are mapping and monitoring 35 countries, identifying initiatives, good practice, and sharing successful strategies. So I'd say that this radical and abrupt and intense and dramatic pandemic has the power to foment, I'd say, a momentum of a deep transformation, deep reinvention, deep change, but especially, I'd say, and I would emphasize, crucial choices. There will be a pre-COVID world and a post-COVID world. In its core, in its essence, I do think that this devastating pandemic warns us that we share the same fears, the same risks, the same threats, the same fate, but we also share the same humanity. We share the same responsibility to save lives and to embrace solidarity, empathy, and human rights for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Flavia. And our last speaker, last but certainly not least, is Sergio Aguayo, who is a Mexican scholar and who has actively promoted human rights and democracy. He did his PhD at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's a professor at El Colegio de Mexico since 1977. He's the author of several books and papers on national security, democracy, US-Mexico relations, and refugees. As a journalist, Aguayo has been writing columns since 1974. He has been widely awarded as a human rights activist and has participated in organizations like the Mexican Academy of Human Rights and Civic Alliance. In 2014, he was named visiting professor at Harvard University in residence at FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. The floor is yours, Sergio.
Eva, and thanks to Kathryn and to Flavia. I am honored to share with you this panel. Yes, I have been studying peace and violence for about 4 decades, but I have not only concentrated on the victims, but also on the perpetrators. I mean, why and how police forces or presidents decide to torture or assassinate groups of people. Why, how the know-how of the political police, Mexican political police, was transferred to the criminal gangs. Therefore, I have studied the political and criminal perpetrators, and because there is a very clear connection in Mexico at least. So what I have observed after the coronavirus started as a world crisis was how rapidly Mexican organized crime reacted to the health crisis. And I'm going to show a few slides. I hope I don't make a mistake. Let me see. Yes. Well, let's see. Yes. Well, I don't know what I am doing, but you can guess. Well, you can see it. This table, you can see the parts in red, places, states in Mexico where organized crime has distributed food pantries as a way, and I am quoting an op-ed by Ernest Falco in The Guardian, a criminal leader in Guerrero, that said that we are distributing food because if we protect local populations, they will protect us as well. Now, I know that there is, and let me show you a few slides of the different organizations. This is El Chapo Guzman from Sinaloa. Jalisco Nueva Generación is from the state of Jalisco. And this is El Señorón from the, I don't know which state, Guerrero, I think. This is the family of El Chapo that are using the opportunity to promote the brand of El Chapo, 7001, which is the name of the brand. Now, let me, okay, I go back now to the image. They're doing that, I mean, as I told you, this is a way to win the sympathy of society. And there is, of course, a long tradition. Al Capone and the soup kitchens in 1930, for example, after the Great Depression, is one clear example. Although Capone in 1930 was not a delinquent legally. He was a free citizen and entrepreneur, dealer with used furniture, according to his card, but he was not a criminal. What we are seeing now is criminal cartels that are distributing food to win the sympathy in urban areas that are supposed to be controlled by the government. Therefore, what we are seeing, the more striking aspect of all this is the paralysis of the state and society. They simply don't know how to react to this, to the presence of criminals winning the sympathy of some sectors of society. And that brings to the question, to a broader question. What are we supposed to do as human rights defenders, as academic thinkers or public intellectuals, whatever? I think that there is a huge field of inquiry that we have to cover to understand what is going on at this moment. And I go back to the basic concept that was put forward by Robert Putnam in his famous study about Italy and how democracy works, because he made a very clear equation. If society organized, that is positive for democracy. In that book, Putnam mentioned on passing, thinking about Sicily, that of course there was a possibility that society could organize for bad goals. to support the criminals. That was the case in Sicily, but he didn't go deep on that. I conduct a seminar at Colegio de Mexico, and we have been studying for the last 6 to 7 years the logic of the perpetrators. Why criminal bands behave in such and such way? Why they decapitate? For example, what is the meaning? What is the goal? Instead of just killing someone. And what we have been studying is what I called negative social capital, which is that part of the population that in their own free will decide to share values with organized crime. We applied a survey in 12 municipalities in 2014, for example. We got the funds. I mean, it's very expensive. Mexico is a huge country. Therefore, it was very expensive, that survey. And we found that about between 20 and 30% of the population share some values with organized crime. For example, to carry a gun is considered not only positive, but desirable as a proof of manhood. Beating a woman is justified as part of the culture. Accepting corruption or bribes is acceptable as well, or giving bribes or accepting or tolerating corruption is acceptable, and so on. And there were, of course, variations depending on the conditions of each one of the cities. We applied that survey in counties, municipalities. And what we have continued to do that research in concrete cases in different parts of the country. And what we found is that criminal cartels have a clear strategy to build a organized social base. For example, they established in some cities orphanage because that was an ideal place to select hitmen, sicarios. It was a deliberate strategy. And in terms of human rights, this brings a huge challenge, because how are we going to deal with this? In Mexico City, there is a fascinating experiment that we are participating in, studying. It is called Pilares. It's a pet project of the mayor of Mexico City, a woman, Claudia Sheinbaum. And they are building 300 community centers in different parts of the city to strengthen social capital, or peace networks, as they call it. Human rights, I mean, the ideas of human rights. But what we have found that in some places, the only way to put the community centers in that specific locality, and Mexico City has 8 million inhabitants, it's like Sao Paulo, it's a huge megalopolis, is that for them to install the community center, they have to obtain the authorization of the local bus, criminal bus. Therefore, at the end, the question is how you are going to how are you going to instill human rights ideas in a community in which you obtain the authorization of the criminal lord? That is not an easy solution. Of course, we are working on that. And that brings me, Kathryn, to the question of individual responsibilities. Because in the case of criminal gangs, it's difficult to see what individuals, citizens can do. Or in the case, Flavia, of a multilateral organization, the International Commission of Human Rights, I must say that the multilateral organizations are not paying enough attention to the question of organized crime in countries like Brazil, Central America, Mexico, Italy even. The only international organization that I have seen is paying attention to this is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which in the Brazil Declaration of 2014 recognized that the crime could be reason for displacement. But it's just a statement. It is not a doctrine, I mean, or a proof doctrine. Therefore, I don't have an answer. I'm just posing a major problem for those of us who have devoted our lives to the study of human rights and violence, because we need to find an answer. Otherwise, we are, and I'm going to finish with a paradox. Organized crime flourishes more in countries or regions that defend human rights, because they are very skillful in using human rights to their advantage, and the use of the Fifth Amendment in the hearings of US Congress is an example. I don't have an answer. I mean, I'm just posing a major challenge that it has come to the open with the health crisis we are facing now. In Mexico, they are taking advantage to extend the reach and to win credibility in some regions. It's difficult to defend human rights in the 21st century. There is no doubt about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you to all panelists. So we do have a lot of questions that came in from the audience, and I will try to synthesize some of them because they do touch on similar issues, and some of them perhaps are more directed to one of you, but I think most of them are touch upon the subjects that you all addressed in your talks and your presentations. So a couple of audience members wanted to pose the question about the fact that not everyone can afford to practice the policies of, for example, social distancing, and especially in Latin American countries where inequality or social inequality is a big problem. And that's where Sergio mentioned, that's where organized crime groups can come in and delivering these packages to families that otherwise do not receive services from government institutions. But how does economic inequality and perhaps rights to economic basic income and survival, how do you see that impacting the current situation, and what could be the solutions to that? Not so much a human, because economic provisioning is also part of having food, and having shelter is part of human rights. So who wants to?
In on that? First, I would say that one of the theorists I draw on in this book is a political theorist named Iris Marion Young. There's a beautiful book called Responsibility for Justice. And she says that there are parameters that we can use to try to talk about who has more responsibility, right? And two of those parameters are power and privilege. In other words, it's a way of thinking about, so that's why I said everyone connected to a structural injustice and able to act has responsibility. But it means there's differential responsibilities, of course, for people who are unable to act because they can't social distance, or because they're so caught up with just the day-to-day problems of survival. Obviously have different levels. There's different expectations what we can expect, right? And in fact, a big part of my book is actually aimed at privileged people, because I talk about things like climate change, for example. Responsibility for climate change. 50% of lifestyle emissions, climate emissions in the world, are produced by the 10% wealthiest people in the world. So no, responsibilities are not evenly distributed, and privileged people do need to step forward and do more. And less privileged people do not, the same burden cannot be placed on them.
Yes, Sergio.
Okay, I did it on my own. Yes, Kathryn, but then are we providing the necessary tools to understand the new panorama that we are facing now? I mean, I'm thinking of the public intellectuals, like the three of us, I mean, that we are involved in the public debate. And sometimes I feel, Mexico, but I also see in the US that we are behind, that we are not giving the answers that the public is demanding, because when somebody writes me from a region where crime controlled by crime, he says, what can I do to defend my rights? Well, I cannot tell him go to the local police, because I know that the police is controlled by the criminals and so on and so forth. So the same, I mean, the patents, the question of patents, it is not enough to use reason or humanitarian ideas, but what can we do in practice? That's the question I constantly raise in my mind. Perhaps we need different political leaders.
Well, if I can just say that the more chapters of the book are devoted to the right and the responsibility to vote. Okay, so yes, I think we need different political leaders, and I think in that involves not just the human right to vote, but involves responsibilities to vote, and responsibilities for people at all levels, state and all the way down, to help people vote. Okay, and so obviously the states, and in the United States, literally the states of the United States have huge responsibilities to make the right to vote realizable. But guess what? Those states are doing it on purpose. States in the United States are trying to suppress the vote. So if we just say, oh, the government has to make it possible for people to vote, well, then we're just playing into the scenario where those states are trying to suppress. So we need to have a grassroots movement for everyone to help people vote. I've talked about it mainly with regard to students. Universities and professors are now finally stepping up to really talk about the right and responsibility to vote. Something political scientists in the United States never said anything to help their students vote. And now we're starting to do it. So yes, we need new leaders, and to do that in democratic countries where democracy is functioning, in the United States, 40% of eligible voters don't vote. If those 40%, and they're not, some of those are suppressed, and some of those, like some students, couldn't be bothered. So it's a rights issue, it's a responsibility issue, and it's important to change our leaders. Yes. Now, can I just say one more thing? Because I'm not saying that all situations are equally amenable to individual responsibility, and I completely agree with you that the situation you describe of organized crime is not at all a place where we would ask individuals to step forward and take responsibility. It's incredibly dangerous, right? So I completely agree that there's different levels. Some issues lend themselves more to this than other issues. And some issues, it's impossible for individuals to do much.
May I? Yeah. So I'd like to share 3 thoughts on that, 3 reactions. The first, hearing from Sergio, we have the same level of organized crime. I don't know if it's the same, but we have this challenging here in Brazil, in the whole country, actually. And my view is that if there is no state, there is organized crime, especially when you have people lacking the basic needs. So they offer, as you mentioned, food and care and assistance. So and this brings my second thought. The level of inequality in the region is the most unequal region in the planet. So I think this is the opportunity. This is the opportunity because we are talking about saving lives. I couldn't imagine another flag which would be more important, more prior than saving lives. So I think it's the moment to review our policies, taxation, economic system, all the public policies and international as well. I served for 4 years at the UN High-Level Task Force on the implementation of the right to development. And we are very much stressing that development should incorporate the human rights approach, and the human rights should incorporate the development approach. I think this is the time right now. This is the time. And my third reaction is that I do remember our agenda in the Commission last November, last December and January. The main I'd say the main topic of the human rights agenda in Latin America was exactly demonstrations in all countries against social injustice. So the Commission was in Ecuador. We went to Colombia. We went to Haiti in December. And we conduct in local visit in Chile in the last week of January. And what was the criticism? It was the privatization of social services like health, like education. So people were asking more state in terms of expansion of public service. Of course, then you have all the debate of public spending and how to share and how to create. I think we need to really to take this view that we have a great opportunity to have creativity, to have, I'd say to find out which strategy could be more effective to reduce poverty and the levels of inequality. And another, just a footnote, last November in Ecuador, in the Inter-American Forum, we adopt a report on business and human rights Inter-American standards. So I think this is another chapter, if you consider that, if you take into consideration that 100, the biggest economies in the world, if you take the universe of 100, 69 of them are transnationals. So transnationals, that could make profits which are higher than the national product of many states. So I think it's really time, although our mandate in the Commission is to focus more on the state responsibility, that's our mandate, our equation, human rights and legal responsibilities of states, but I think we have to open the view and to really focus on the responsibilities to different actors, especially in this moment, so challenging and so hard moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Flavia. Thank you, everyone. A lot of the listeners and viewers are posing questions about both harsh crime control measures, but also on the other hand, the need to ensure the protection of rights of people who are incarcerated. So on the one hand, we have seen examples from several countries of police using excessive violence against those who are disobeying curfew orders. And there is some sense that there is citizen support for these harsh enforcement measures. But on the other hand, a lot of prisons are overcrowded. A lot of people are staying in prisons in pre-trial detention, and there is definitely not enough access to public health or possibility to control the spread of disease within jails, and there are calls for releasing more vulnerable people who are incarcerated and perhaps finished most of their sentences. So this question of what would be the most effective and most humane crime control policies, but also dealing with people who don't lose their rights just because they are incarcerated. And this, of course, brings the bigger question that some of the readers also posed of the legacy of military dictatorship and authoritarian regimes in Latin American countries. So whereas now there is support for involving the military and maybe the police in controlling and helping with the situation and enforcing curfews, but on the other hand, how do we make sure, what kind of international cooperation there can be to make sure that these authoritarian measures or measures that can be seen as authoritarian if they last for extended amount of time, that they don't settle in. So this is really a two-level question if you want to talk about the prisoner rights or excessive violence on the hand of the police, or if you want to address more the bigger question of authoritarian tendencies and military involvement. It's up to you. And Flavia wants to go first. Okay.
Thank you so much. I just like to mention regarding the persons deprived of liberty, we have a dramatic situation in Latin America, because 40% of the people who are deprived of liberty are under preventive detention, on average 40%. In Haiti, achieves 70%. So I think, and we, the Commission, we have some recommendations regarding persons deprived of liberty. And one of those recommendations is exactly to take measures to address overcrowding in prisons, including reassessing cases of preventive detention in order to adopt alternative sanctions, prioritizing older people, pregnant women. And here, I was just reading this morning that in Brazil, the lethality of persons deprived of liberty is 5 times more than the general population. In Brazil today, we have 239 people who are infected in prisons and 13 deaths. Of course, I think those numbers are too low, in my opinion, but that's a problem, because how to keep social distance when we have prisons which are totally overcrowded? So I just like to mention these recommendations. And many countries, Brazil as well, we have a National Council of Judicial Branch who adopt a resolution on that. In Argentina, there was a debate about that. It's highly controversial, but there was a debate. So in many countries, we are, our resolution, we can see the increasing impact of the resolution in different angles and including recommendations towards persons deprived of liberty.
Thank you. Sergio?
Okay. I want to refer to an op-ed written by Frank Bruni, the New York Times 3 or 4 days ago on May 2nd. He interviewed the woman that anticipated this crisis, Lori Garrett. I think she has become a celebrity now in terms of the capacity she had 5 years ago to anticipate what we are living. And what she anticipates is that in the best case scenario, we still have 36 months to go, about 3 years, to finally pass this health crisis. I don't know if that's the case, because I mean, as everybody else, I'm trying to get informed about what is going on, and I am not a scientist in the sense of the one that is alive looking at microscopes. But she also said in relation to human relations and to power structures and states and societies, history is moving in front of us. That is, in her opinion, this is one of those moments in which we are going to redefine ways to tackle with universal problems and very concrete problems, individual, group problems, national problems, international ones. And perhaps that is the main lesson. I don't know if if she is right or not, but I am anticipating a very intense period in which we academics, intellectuals, have the responsibility of explaining and giving answers or tentative answers to be tried by some people in government or in society. I know, and that includes prisons, because we have the same problems that in Brazil, and Central America has the same problems. I mean, and the US, in which, I mean, I keep reading, in most countries of this hemisphere, at least, I don't want to go into Europe because that's different, or Asia, but at least in this hemisphere, we share the prison question, and I don't have an answer to release them, to isolate them, or what? To think about it in a broader framework. And taking the advice, history is in front of us, and the paradigms that we used to have to analyze reality has changed, perhaps forever, but we must be aware of that.
Thank you, Sergio. Kathryn, do you want to add something? Please unmute yourself.
On Sergio's great point about history being in front of us. One thing the political science literature, the international relations literature has told us about global change is that global change, important global change, has happened after crises, mainly wars, but other crises, okay? And so the big change happened after the global depression and after World War II, for example. And just the way that those generations were shaped by that experience are, you know, this world, as Sergio says, will be shaped by. Now, and so the issue is what ideas were present. Human rights itself, as we know, the international protection of human rights was born after World War II, and it was born out of the disaster of the Holocaust. And so we know that new ideas are possible. New global ideas are possible that come out of crises, but the response that depends on whether people are putting forward alternative plans and visions. So what are the visions that we want to place forward in order to shape this historical moment where we know change will be possible?
Thank you. One of the questions that came in has to do with this complication between religious freedom and the perhaps restriction on religious organizations. So as you know, here in the United States, a large part of the protests have been against the stay-at-home orders, had to do with the churches, and some churches have been holding services, and the person who is posing the question mentions that there have been similar protests or acts of defiance in Brazil, particularly related to evangelical churches. So could the panelists reflect on religious organizations and religious freedom in Latin America during the pandemic? Flavia?
I'd say that, of course, we have the human rights, we have religion freedom, to have a religion, to change religion, or not to have any religion. But I do think that is in this moment, we have to prioritize public health, because social distance is the human vaccine we do have right now. We do not have treatment, we do not have a vaccine. So washing hands and social distance are the only measure that we have. So I'd say that we have to be creative in this sense, like online ceremonies, religious ceremonies. Of course, I do think that spiritual health is really important. And we have many dimensions of health. Mental health, physical health, spiritual health is really important. But I do think that this is the moment, and I'd like to emphasize what are the visions the question raised by Kathryn, I think we need right now creativity. We need to find out ways to learn this COVID, and Sergio, I think you're right, and the post-COVID time. And I think we have to open our mind and to find out alternative ways.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to address religious freedom? Kathryn.
You know, rights have always come in conflict with other rights. And so this is nothing new. And so one's rights are always limited by the rights of others, right? And so at this point, one's right to religion come into conflict with the collective right to health, and in some ways with the right to life, okay? And it seems to me that in those situations, I completely agree with Flavia. It's, you know, people need to find creative ways to express their religion without endangering the rights of others, the health rights of others. And we're seeing this now with the vaccine issue as well, you know, the anti-vaxxers, right? And that is that we have, you know, no, sometimes your right to express your religion, or in this case, your very unscientific ideas, your very false ideas about science, you know, do not give you the right to endanger the health rights of others. You know, we just will never get herd immunity if this unscientific view that vaccines are harmful, that all vaccines are harmful, combined with the view that you have a right to do that regardless of the impact it has on anybody else.
Thank you. Sergio?
Very briefly, I fully agree with Flavia. I mean, I cannot agree more. This is a time for collective rights. And respecting religious rights, we have a responsibility to ensure the health of the community. I know that this is very polemic in New York with the Hasidic community or Israel, but in the case of Mexico, I must praise the government of the capital that there is a celebration of Holy Week. Every year in Iztapalapa, they put together about 3 million people. It is 176 years old, the tradition. It was created by another plague. And this year, it was the first time, as far as I can remember, it was forbidden, the crowds. It was transmitted by television. And I think that's the kind of responsibility of governments, of the religious groups and the religious leadership, because as far as I remember, the Catholic hierarchy in Mexico City accepted that it was the moment for collective rights to be given priority.
Thank you, Sergio. So I think there is one more substantial question. I know that you are asked to answer these very difficult questions. So there's one more topical question and one more question before we depart. But one issue that has come up is the question of what happens to the right to asylum and to the right of people to move. And especially this has been happening on the United States and Mexico border with US now not processing any asylum cases and a lot of asylum seekers stuck in Mexico, but this is also happening with Venezuelan migrants not being welcome anymore in Colombia, and I think as well in Brazil and in Ecuador. So who, if it is not the national governments, who is able to take responsibility of these people who are stuck where they are now and perhaps don't have access to the healthcare services And I see Kathryn has an answer. Great.
No, I don't. I say, Yeva, this is your research question. And I think at this point you should step forward and share some of your own research on the border with about and answer this question.
Oh, I wish I had the answer. I only have, so far I'm seeing the negative effects, that is basically in a lot of northern Mexican towns, they have been waiting already for the past few years because of the changes to US policy with the Remain in Mexico program that asks asylum seekers to wait, also with the metering at different ports of entry. But now all of their asylum interviews have been postponed, and people are staying in Matamoros. They're staying in this big camp. Elsewhere, they're staying in shelters where, similarly to prisons, social distancing is very difficult, and there is much less help coming from the United States side of the border. International organizations from, even Doctors Without Borders, they're still present, but there is much less involvement, and fewer people from religious organizations are coming to provide food and medical aid in northern Mexico. So at least there are no answers, and people don't really know where they would go if they get sick, and they don't know who is protecting their rights. So the situation is not very good, and I think it requires international action. Does anyone else want to speak? Okay, Flavia and then Sergio.
In the Commission, in our work, we are sharing the dramatic situation of many countries when you do have a strong pattern of human rights violation. As a result, we have refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. The situation of Venezuela, for example, we have right now 4.5 million people who are other in Colombia. We have 1 million, or Peru, 800, and Nicaragua as well, because of the level of serious human rights violation pattern. So in our recommendations here, again, I'd like to quote our Resolution 1/2020. We make here 5 recommendations to the states. And I do agree, Eva, with your view: international cooperation, shared responsibilities among international community, to avoid the use of strategies of detention right now, to guarantee the right to return and migrant return to the state or territory of origin or nationality through cooperation, exchange of information, to adopt protocols, to adopt economy recovery policies. So this is a dramatic situation, because I do think that when you have a refugee, is because when you have a migrant, especially refugee, is because a human rights violation happened somewhere. And then you have the cycle of human rights violations before, during, and after. And now with the pandemic, the situation is really, it gets even more serious.
Thank you. Sergio?
Yes, a colleague from the FXB, Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard School of Public Health, Jackie Baba, made a very, very concrete definition of the government policies in the US, Mexico, and Central America towards migrants. Systemic cruelty. That's what she says. And I will add that migrants in my country, and I am very, very sad about it, are caught between the systemic cruelty of the two governments and the systemic brutality of the cartels. It is hell in the borders. The borders are really retroceso, going back to the periods of brutality and barbarism. And I am really sad and ashamed for that. And I'm glad that you raised the issue, but I think there is not the time, and the health of the majority in the different countries is going to prevail, I am afraid, because this moment is also a barometer of the strength of human rights values in societies. And I think Mexicans are not faring very, very well at that, with that criteria. It's the way it is, but we have the responsibility, the moral responsibility of speaking out, even if what we said is not pleasant to societies or government officials. That's the prerogative. Ours is to say what we believe is going on. Thank you.
Thank you. So to wrap it up and to echo a few of the people who asked what can we as academics or as scholars, what is our responsibility in this time of the pandemic? And some of you already mentioned what we should be doing, but I'll just quote a question from a student and then pose it to you. As an aspiring scholar here at the University of Florida, I am interested in the decolonization of my research. In terms of our responsibility as academics, researching areas where human rights might be violated, what can we do as scholars to bring to light the injustices and violations of human rights? What recommendation does any of you give in order to balance the roles of armchair and activist scholarship? Thank you. Who wants to go first?
So let me just try a few things. One is that it's very difficult to, in the United States, it's very difficult to simultaneously be an activist academic and to get tenure. And so my first advice would be for young people is that you need to keep your mind on your research, but you should choose research topics that are, that you feel passionately committed to. And then you should do the best possible research and publishing on those topics. And that itself is an important act, okay? But that to become the kind of public intellectuals that, like a Sergio Aguayo or a Flávia Piovesan, that takes a lifetime. And with every year, people they've acquired more stature and more security, and they're able to do, I think, more and more at the level of a public intellectual. And all junior scholars should not hold themselves to the standards that are being set by people like Flavia and Sergio.
Well, Kathryn touched on a practical issue. I mean, we touch on subjects that are not acceptable to the established governments or entrepreneurs or whatever. I mean, or I'm thinking in the cartels. I mean, they don't like what we do or what I do in doing that research. But I think we have three responsibilities. I already mentioned one. We must react to the new situation, that I won't repeat. Second, that was, it was mentioned by Kathryn. Yes, we have the responsibility of helping as much as possible young scholars to not protect in the sense of the Middle Ages in which you have a bunch of apprentices in your workshop, but to really establish an open dialogue, that you have the responsibility of opening the paths and protecting. I was protected by Lorenzo Meyer when I was a young scholar, and he was a senior professor at the Colegio de México, and he prevented them to expel me, to let me go, as it is. I mean, and I remain in the Colegio, and now I am a senior scholar. And finally, I would, another task, and that we have advanced a lot since the 1960s and 70s when we hardly communicate as colleagues between Mexico and the US, for example, or Mexico and Brazil. We were in our own worlds. We must emphasize the need for constant communication of what we are doing, at what are hypotheses. One of the positive things about COVID is that we are now using this instrument of communications to share ideas that would take $5,000 in another context and 3 days of your life to go to Sao Paulo or Boston. I mean, go stay 1 day and go back. So let's use this new technology to our advantage. And in that, Dr. Class, I think, is doing a great service organizing this kind of events, because Dr. Class has the privilege of having a presence everywhere in the region, as we in Colegio de Mexico have. So that, I think, those are the 3 tasks that we have. And yes, time, patience, and think this is a marathon and not a 100 meters run. I mean, this is a lifetime endeavor. I mean, let's reconcile with your private right to personal right to have a full private life. I mean, and I think the 3 of us have learned that in the hard way.
Thank you, Sergio. Flavia?
Thank you so much for this inspiring question. When I think about research, and we have to make choices. We have to make choices. And we have to raise 3 questions: what, how, and what for. And I do think that we are facing a moment that science, we listen about science all the time. So we want public policies based on science, and we are expecting the science to provide a vaccine, to save lives in the world, millions of lives. And I do think that we have to ask ourselves, which role shall social science play in this momentum? Because of course we have different channels of science, as the crisis, the pandemic, has this multidimensional nature. So I think we do have a very important role in this moment. For example, doing comparative research, identifying best practice, making impact with scientific information, with solid research, which policies should be adopted, which are the best practice and the worst practice. So I do think that we have a crucial role to play in this moment, all of us. And now I'd like to quote my professor, Kathryn. All of us have responsibilities, aggravated responsibilities, especially in Corona times. But I learned with Kathryn the importance of hope. And I learned with you that hope sustains our human rights work. Not just any hope, but a hope that is reasoned, well-informed. So I think that's the time for reason, time for science in all fields, and to give meaningful response to a meaningful life. That's my advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. This is a very inspiring way to end this webinar. We did go a little bit over time. I want to thank again all of our speakers calling in from different corners of Latin America, and David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, who organized this webinar, and everyone who tuned in and posed questions. It's very sad. One of the sad features of Zoom is that I don't see the audience, and we can't all clap together, because that's what I would like to do. But thank you everyone once again, and join us for future events wherever they are.